Protests erupt across the United States as thousands of demonstrators take to the streets. Real issues of racism and police brutality shape the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. Hello, I'm A.N.S.W.E.R, and this is The Heat. With fewer than 100 days to go before Americans head to the voting booths in November, President Donald Trump faces an uphill battle to win re-election. A number of polls give former Vice President Joe Biden the lead nationally, as well as in key battleground states. But that's not the only challenge Trump is facing. The president is also dealing with a growing health crisis and faltering economy. The question now, will Trump be able to turn things around? We begin our coverage with CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. And Nathan, one of the big headlines on Monday, very late on Monday afternoon, the United States entering phase 3 of a coronavirus vaccine trial. We've just been hearing from Dr. Anthony Fauci, the country's expert on infectious diseases. What can you tell us?
Yeah, this is the most optimistic of all the vaccines out there in the United States. It's a joint initiative between the National Institutes of Health, which of course Dr. Anthony Fauci is a part, and Moderna, the pharmaceutical company. And essentially 30,000 people are going to be tested, half with a placebo, half with the actual vaccine. It's a different vaccine. It's a synthetic one. Hopes are high, and the idea is to have it available potentially at the end of this year, beginning of next, and ramp up production. Dr. Anthony Fauci just spoke to CNN with Wolf Blitzer in the chair. Let's take a listen.
But now it's crunch time. We're trying to figure out, does it actually work? So it's a 30,000 person trial. 15,000 will get the vaccine, 15,000 will get a placebo. The trial was launched today. This is truly, Wolf, record time.
So you can see his enthusiasm there. Record time, he's right, most vaccines take decades. I think the quickest is measles, about 8 years. He also, by the way, just qualifying what he just said, in that interview said there is no guarantee whatsoever. But you can see the timing here, can't you? You know, the US president, as you said, is having difficulty with his re-election. If a vaccine became available and the scientists like Dr. Fauci backed it in, say, October, beginning of November, that could change things.
Nathan, the other big story, and that is the demonstrations that are sweeping over some parts of the country. President Trump defending the deployment of federal forces to quell these protests, especially those in Portland, Oregon. He is portraying himself as the president of law and order. Is that a winning election strategy?
Well, he thinks it is. Now, remember, this all began just yards from where I'm standing, meters where I'm standing, when militarized units, along with regular police, actually cleared Lafayette Square, where he walked over and held that Bible outside St. John's Church. And since then, you know, he kind of liked that idea. And there have been, of course, demonstrations continuing across the country. He passed the Monuments Executive Order, which essentially says that federal police and units can protect monuments and installations like the courthouse in Portland. And he's dropped some not so heavy political hints as well, saying the protesters want to destroy the suburbs and things like that. So this is completely aimed at a core demographic, which essentially are suburban voters, one would say women as well, which are very much needed, especially in swing states, to win him the election. Now, there is a law and order argument, but a lot of the local government officials in Portland, in Austin, in Chicago, where apparently units are turning up, saying when you arrive, things get worse. And there have even been leaks to the media from the White House saying some advisors say that the president is looking for video that could help him get re-elected. And there has been a huge upswell of counter-protests, including lines of so-called moms, dads, veterans. So it may not necessarily play the way he wants, but it is definitely a very divisive move just less than 100 days to the election, Anna.
Certainly is. CGTN's Nathan King there from the White House. Thanks, Nathan. Well, for more now on the countdown to 2020, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Eugene, Oregon via Skype, Joe Lowndes is a political science professor at the University of Oregon. With us here in Washington, Joseph Williams is a senior news editor at U.S. News and World Report, and also here in Washington, D.C. Brian Becker joins us via Skype. He's the executive director of the A.N.S.W.E.R coalition, a group comprised of anti-war and civil rights organizations. Welcome to all of you. Joseph Williams, let me start with you, and let's start with these protests. We've seen them every night on our television screens, the ones in Portland, Oregon, but now they've spread to other cities in Oakland, California, Los Angeles, as well as in Seattle, in Washington state. The government has deployed federal paramilitary units to quell these demonstrations. What's driving them at this stage? What do the demonstrators hope to achieve? And what do you make of the government's response to it?
Well, this is remarkable for something in the United States to have protests over the killing of George Floyd some month and a half, 2 months ago. To sustain this level of protest and demands for police accountability is remarkable, given what we've seen in recent years, where protests might last a day, a week or two, and then just kind of peter out. So ultimately, that's what the protesters say that they're asking for, is police accountability. Now, that's kind of morphed since President Trump has thrown in with law enforcement, federal law enforcement and paramilitary organizations, sent them to Portland in essence to protect federal property. But what it seems that they have done is make the protesters even more agitated, because reporting out of Portland seemed to indicate that the protests were quelling down, they were ratcheting down a bit, and were for the most part peaceful. But sending in federal troops did, it seems, stir up the hornet's nest, which, as your correspondent might have indicated, might have been the entire point. So at this point, it's morphed from protection of African-American lives against police brutality to somewhere between anti-totalitarianism and states' rights, and trying to get federal authorities out of local matters.
So, Joseph, have the demonstrations changed in one respect, in that it's not just about police brutality right now? There's a wider range of issues.
That's exactly right. Yeah. One of them is that Trump seems to have provoked even more anger than was already there, and now a lot of protesters have turned against the president. You have moms, you have veterans, you have grandmothers, grandparents, people who aren't normally associated with the Black Lives Matter protests are hitting the streets, and hitting the streets hard, especially in confronting the federal law enforcement officers that are there on the streets. So it seems that it has transitioned a little bit to the chagrin of some Black Lives Matter activists who believe the central message has kind of gotten lost in these confrontations.
All right, let me bring in Joe Lowndes. Joe, you are there in Oregon, and you've written extensively about these demonstrations that have been taking place. Well, President Trump has defended the use of federal forces to quell these demonstrations. He says he is a law and order president. Of course, some others see this just as an election tactic. You've written about this, and you've said it's urban siege as campaign strategy. But how big a role will these demonstrations play in the upcoming election?
Well, that remains to be seen what role they'll play. But, you know, for now, I think what's happened, as Joseph Williams said, is it has had the effect of not just stirring up protesters who were already on the streets on behalf of Black Lives Matter, but it has brought into the streets many more types of people. As Joseph Williams says, mothers, grandmothers, veterans, also teachers groups, nurses groups, all sorts of people are now showing up. I was there on Saturday night, and the crowd was absolutely enormous, and it was incredibly diverse, the kinds of people who were there. What they shared in common was a central focus on the message of Black Lives Matter about police brutality and police killings of black people. But now it also has morphed into this larger issue. It's the idea that you have federal agents here on the streets really does bring more people out and makes it a larger kind of national issue, which of course Trump hopes to do. The question is whether or not this will be something that, you know, it's not, you know, say Richard Nixon ran on a law and order platform in both 68 and 1972. But what he did between 68 and 72 was enlarge his coalition and convince a greater number of Americans that the threat of riots or major anti-war protests or black crime was something that was detrimental to all Americans. And he was able to build a broad Republican coalition out of that. Trump has done almost the reverse, which is to not have built out his coalition at all. So he's stuck in a situation that he really needs to fire up the base and get them out. So probably this message is very tailor-made, and he doesn't really have very many other cards to play. So this one is a way of doing that. It's dangerous because law and order rhetoric is one thing, used by Nixon, used by Reagan, used by Bush, even used by Bill Clinton. It's another thing when you actually use federal marshals and Border Patrol and other DHS agents to actually physically come out into the streets and engage in violence against citizens, in this type of thing as an election strategy.
That's right, Joe Lowndes. In fact, this law and order issue comes up at every election. The Republicans portray themselves as being the leaders or those who can impose law and order in this country, and the Democrats as not being capable of imposing law and order. In fact, you've said something very interesting. You said law and order is by definition authoritarian.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that if you were there to impose order, that's not a democratic message. That's not a message of inclusion, of participation, of drawing more people into a political process, of expanding and allowing more voices to help shape the direction of the polity. It's not really a language of popular sovereignty. It's a language of rule from the top. And it's a rule through violence, of course. It's the idea that if you're imposing law and order, you do that with police. You do that with agents. You do that with people who are going to be a repressive force on society. So, in that sense, some people want that, some people don't want that, but the message itself is an authoritarian message.
All right, let me bring in Michael Johns. He is the national leader of the U.S. Tea Party movement. He joins us from Bethlehem in the state of Pennsylvania. Michael, great to see you. What are we to make, Michael, of critics who say that these strong-arm tactics that we're seeing on the streets of some cities are not really about law and order, they're just part of a re-election strategy?
Well, firstly, for the most part, the reaction by federal authorities has been very minimal. It's been one of the great criticisms is that federal agencies have been so constrained by state and city powers to actually get engaged. And one of the great, I think, disappointments are that these cities are not enforcing the rule of law. I couldn't disagree more with this idea that somehow our rule of law is autocratic or somehow not rooted in a sensible approach. It's designed by elected officials. If we don't like those elected officials, we remove those elected officials. Our law enforcement does not make the laws, they simply enforce them. And for the most part, they do an exceptionally good job of that in this country, and that is the viewpoint of the vast majority of Americans.
All right, Joe Lowndes, and I'll give you a chance to respond to that. What do you make of that law and order is not necessarily autocratic?
City and state officials all over the country have now either asked or demanded or looked for court injunctions to keep the feds out of their cities. And so the question of elected officials and the role of elected officials, the people elected historically to maintain law and order have been states and cities. It's in the Constitution, and it's been that way since then. It's ruled by locals and ruled by states, which is what empowers police forces. It's not a federal job to go out into cities and enforce law and order. Mayors don't. 6 mayors today said they didn't want to see that, and same with state governors and attorneys general. So you could say that it's about elected officials, but in this case, it's really an executive agency at the top, which is imposing this on the states and local.
All right, let me go to Brian Becker. Brian, great to see you as well. What do you make of these protests and the fact that, as Michael Johns has told us, federal forces are really not using a lot of force? It's minimal.
Well, it's designed by Donald Trump to pour gasoline on the fire, and he knows full well, because he tried this again on June 1st. Remember when he strode across Lafayette Park and carried out a violent assault, had his forces carry out a violent assault against peaceful protesters in the media so that he could have a photo op taken in front of St. John's Church with a Bible. All of that was designed to be part of his re-election campaign. Now, because he's failing, and he's failing because of the way the federal government handled the COVID-19 crisis, the fact that this is the epicenter of the epicenter, the fact that 61 million Americans have applied for unemployment insurance since mid-March, the fact that there are nationwide protests going on and that they're growing in spite of Donald Trump. He's in trouble. He's behind. He's losing. So what can he do? He's trying to change the subject by intensifying the confrontation between the federal government and people who are in the streets all over the country so that he can portray himself as the tough guy, the law and order president, and demonize and caricature the protesters, 99% of whom are peaceful, as nothing but crazy looters. That's his plan. The other part of his plan is to demonize and attack China. Those are the two planks that he has to offer the American people as he fails so miserably going into the November election. The effect of this, though, is, as Trump would certainly well understand, that when you send federal troops or federal forces to snatch and kidnap protesters, take them to undisclosed locations and interrogate them, violate their First and Fourth Amendment right, that not only will the people come out and protest, the moms, the grandmoms, etc., but the local officials. In Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, who's the U.S. the district attorney for Philadelphia, said if they come and do what they did in Portland, he will arrest those federal agents. I mean, this takes the protest to a whole other level, but Donald Trump is desperate. He has no other option. At least that's the way his campaign perceives it.
Michael Johns, Donald Trump is desperate. He's failing. He needs a way out of this. And the way out of this is to go on this law and order ticket as well as attack China.
Yeah, that couldn't be more wrong. I mean, firstly, if you go back to January of this year, this president had an immense re-election story to tell with an economy that was humming at almost unprecedented success levels, more Americans working than ever, 7 million jobs created, all sorts of progress. He did not kill George Floyd. He did not run the police force that was employing George Floyd. He was not there that day. In fact, he's done more to reform our criminal justice system than any president really in our lifetimes. Joe Biden and Barack Obama sat back for 8 years and talked about a lot of things. All of these problems simmered on their watch, and they had absolutely no progress to report. We're now at a point where we have city officials who outrageously are not maintaining the peace in their cities. Innocent individuals have been killed. Immense damage has been done to property. These cities are in anarchy on certain streets. And it is incumbent upon them to enforce the rule of law. We don't select what laws we're going to enforce and what ones we're not. And actually, the federal involvement in all this, I think, in the eyes of most Americans, has, if anything, been very laid back, timid, disengaged. I thought back about when Senator Cotton wrote that column in the New York Times. It was so controversial. That position that he reflected of putting U.S. Forces onto the streets was supported by over 50% of the American people. It's a very mainstream position. If these cities can't establish the rule of law and order and protect their citizens, then there has to be some alternative course. And it has to, of course, be constitutional.
Joseph Williams, does Michael Johns have a point there when he says that no other president has done more for law and order, or more for criminal justice, we should say, than Donald Trump, more than President Barack Obama or Vice President Joe Biden?
I would have to say factually, in a word, no. I mean, I think that's kind of untrue. Number one, President Obama had a couple of urban disturbances on his watch. He also convened a task force to look at modern policing and try to revamp and reform the way law enforcement officers do their jobs. But I kind of understand that this kind of gets conflated with a lot of what's going on right now, but it seems to me that three things are very apparent. Number one, we have a COVID coronavirus response in which the government is basically hands off. They haven't really engaged in helping states figure this thing out. Yet, on the other hand, when states have protests about something that happens in those states, the law enforcement comes down with a heavy hand like it does in Portland. It kind of looks like you're trying to argue both sides and have it both ways. So I don't think that there's a lot of factual evidence to stand on.
Okay, Joseph Williams, I just want to get to two things very quickly. One is, whatever happened to that police task force set up by President Barack Obama? That's one. And I mean, shouldn't we also acknowledge that President Trump got that First Step Act passed?
The task force was disbanded when President Obama left office, number one. And number two, he does get credit, but it doesn't go quite far enough. It really doesn't crack down on a lot of the behaviors that led to the killing of George Floyd, that led to the killing of so many unarmed African Americans across the nation.
Joe Lowndes, let's get back to the demonstrations in Portland, Oregon. I mean, does it surprise you that a city which has a population of almost 3/4, 72% white, became the center of demonstrations for the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, I want to say really quickly that the idea that federal agents have been peaceful in these cities couldn't be more inaccurate. There's been hundreds of people who have suffered fractures, broken bones, internal injuries in Portland alone in the last few weeks. And so this has been reported on by the Oregon.
Who's killed more innocents, protesters or federal agents?
These are protesters by federal agents.
How many Americans are dead because of federal agent behavior?
That's kind of a specious question. I mean, I don't know that there have been any.
Zero.
Number one, and number two, I'm kind of wondering
how many innocents
okay, can we just have one at a time, please? Okay, Joe Lowndes, go ahead.
The question you asked was about how Portland, Oregon, a very white city, has become the center of this. Partly, I think it's that the Trump administration chose Portland because it's been a site of a lot of kind of fascist and anti-fascist street confrontations over the last couple of years, and it's a place where he says that Antifa and violent anarchists and looters are, all the time. So I think that has a certain kind of symbolic value for his base.
Okay.
The thing I think is it allows him to not confront directly black protesters in large numbers. It's like a pilot program. Rolling this out in Portland allows him to kind of like avoid this idea that he's going directly after the black protests of black police murder.
All right.
I would say Portland does have a serious problem on its hands. It's about 6% of the population of Portland is black. About 25% of the police killings in the last 10 years have been black people. The kind of progressive Portland, progressive Oregonians have kind of begun to come to terms with this racist history of Portland and of Oregon, and I think are kind of energetically wanting to take this on, but led by black and brown leadership in Portland.
Okay, Joseph Williams, you wanted to say something very quickly, please.
Sure. I just wanted to say that it's President Trump kind of telegraphed this with the Mount Rushmore speech, that there was American Carnage 2.0. I need to get a grip on this, and people watch me work. I think this is for an audience of red state people who don't live in cities and don't kind of grasp the nuances of what's going on there. You just see police with a heavy hand, law enforcement, winning strategy for him. We'll see.
All right, I want to move on. Brian Becker, I want to move on to politics, to the election, look at the Democrats. There was a piece in Politico which said that Joe Biden, who is the likely opponent in November, is having problems picking a running mate. The main contenders that we hear about every day do not fit the bill. He wants someone who's very similar to himself, according to this piece, when he was vice president. But of course, we know that this time the pick for vice president is very important because it's highly unlikely that Joe Biden will serve a second term. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, it is a big decision for Joe Biden. I think it's quite obvious to everyone, given the fact that Joe Biden really does have trouble putting two sentences together, that once he has even a debate with Donald Trump, his apparent lead, his very strong lead, in fact, and especially in battleground states, could actually dissipate. That, an economic rebound, the return of the coming up of with a vaccine, all of those could turn this thing around right now. But Biden also has a big problem. He inspires no one. His only real claim to fame here is that his name is not Donald Trump. And so he has a lot of pressures on him, especially from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which was essentially crushed when the Democratic Party establishment united to make sure that Joe Biden, even though he was coming in very badly in the polls, suddenly became the only opposite to Bernie Sanders and thus took the nomination. So, yeah, he's promised it will be a woman. I think if it's not a black woman, there will be many people in the black community who will say, well, again, we're being denied. But I don't think that's the real issue for Biden. It's not going to be his vice president. People are going to vote in this election it's going to be a referendum on Donald Trump. The question for Biden is whether he can retain some level of coherence in the debates. That's the Democratic Party's biggest vulnerability.
Michael Jones, doesn't this surprise you, the fact that Joe Biden hasn't really campaigned? He's just turned down an interview with Fox News as well, but still he's leading in the polls.
Not really. I just thought I'd dig up some of the 2016 polls. These were, last polls right before last year's election. CNBC had Clinton plus 10. USA Today, Clinton plus 10. AP, Clinton plus 13. ABC, Clinton plus 12. NBC Wall Street Journal, Clinton plus 10. These polls are no longer reliable in the Trump era. And I think for the most part, Biden has been holed up because there is a great degree of discomfort in his inability to articulate a coherent message. Additionally, he's going to face a very serious challenge here, is that we're really just now entering the political season. These polls, even if they were accurate, would not be terribly significant or meaningful. But American people typically begin paying attention after Labor Day, early September. I think the question is going to be asked. Joe Biden spent 47 years in our federal government in the highest of positions. What did he accomplish? Can you name one thing?
All right, let me go to Joe Williams for that. Is that a fair question, Joseph Williams?
I think it is a fair question, and I actually agree the fact that polls in this era are meaningless, especially in such an unconventional situation where we have an ongoing pandemic, you have turbulence in the streets, you have an unsettled electorate that's really anxious about a lot of things. So it is going to be incumbent upon Joe Biden to articulate a clear message, get a vice presidential running mate that can gin up the electorate and can get people to the polls, and also run a strategy that's going to be able to counterbalance Trump's strength in some very interesting places. I'm talking about middle America, places where electoral votes count a lot more than a popular vote.
Okay, Joseph Williams, very quickly, how big a role will the performance of the economy play in this election? I mean, that's where the president is in trouble, not of his own doing. It's been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. But what will you be looking for at that time?
If it's the economy, we'll be looking for a rebound, lower unemployment numbers, consumer confidence rebounding. I think that's not going to happen, though, until the coronavirus gets under control.
Okay. And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.